All right, welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Demons. That's right, you heard me correctly, City of Demons. It is no longer the City of Angels. However, I am willing to take whatever name you want to give us here. Hollyweird, La La Land, whatever you want to say, folks. Now, you've heard me talk about today's show, and particularly what the two guests are going to be talking about, and what, more importantly, they're going to be showing you in a matter of weeks. I've plugged in this particular movie, which I'm going to say now, The Extraordinary, The Seeding, several times. And I've also given you an example of something that happens in the movie of a veil, which is actually a better term that I was just told. So I'm going to wait to get to that part about the veil, the whole story, until we get a little further along. So without further ado, let me introduce, oh, and we do have one person in Ireland already. See, this is already global, guys, in the chat. So I want to give a shout out to Ireland. And with that being said, let me introduce Jack Roth and Jon Sumple, both producers, and Jon is the director. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to speak to you guys. And Jon, you remember we did this years ago after your first film. Yeah.
Yes, I do remember that. Yeah.
So what
seems like yesterday.
Time flies, guys, really does. So tell me, what was it essentially that caused you to go on this movie? Because unlike the first one, which you had, as you mentioned earlier, a treasure trove of videos and recordings and different things like that, you actually were telling the story not of one person, but of many, and you went deeper. That's
right. Yes. Well, Jon, I'll start this one, I guess. Basically it was, we had done the first one, and it was because we did the first one that we learned some things, and we started to a lot of people started coming to us and telling us their stories. And we had one woman in particular that really told us this compelling story about this false pregnancy she had, and this incredible experience she had in an underground military base. And we realized that we had, in the first film, obviously we talked about one man, Stan Romanek, and he had a ton of evidence and almost a decade's worth of documentation to work with. But we kind of switched gears a little bit and realized that we had to continue to tell the story we had started to tell. And we had just kind of touched upon some things in Stan's story, such as hybridization, these hybrid children that were showing up in his life. And so for the second one, we sat down and we said, well, why don't we just continue this? Why don't we take it further? We'll dig deeper. We'll start to talk to several people about their experiences. And it really started with unexplained pregnancies, because the whole idea of that's so fascinating. And all of these women were coming forward more than, we were kind of surprised at how many women were telling these stories. So that's kind of the impetus for how we first started putting the second film together.
And before, Jon, you say, I'm going to say one thing. This is a phenomenon that has been going on it could be argued that from the time of Jesus, if not before, but several women without having sex are purported to become pregnant, and then without having a miscarriage or an abortion or any other means, their baby's just gone. Usually happens with a memory or at least an inkling of being taken.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is that sometimes, and I think what's going to happen with this film, it is going to be a triggering event for a lot of women in particular, but men as well, who've had experiences that they might go, wow, when that happened to me, I thought it was this. And it's going to, they may question, what truly did happen to them. And I think that, there are people don't even know this is happening to them until there's a 2x4 moment to the head. And like, for example, with Geraldine Orozco, she was not aware of anything happening to her until she had an experience in 2013. And as a result of that experience being so visceral, she decided that she wanted to do a regression. And she had 2 regressions in 2017, early 2017, that completely changed everything for her. And it took her back in time where she realized that she was monitored from a very young age, that she was abducted at a very young age in that 5 to 7 year window, which is, we found out that happened with a lot of women that we spoke to, that they were abducted, monitored, tagged, so to speak, at a very young age, and then monitored through they're 12, 13 years old when they were fertile. And that's when the abductions start to happen with them. And then, there's all these different types of memories through regression that trigger, those memories that this happened to me. And some of the details as they're shared are, they're so visceral and raw and emotional and shocking. So Geraldine shares her experiences. There's several women who share their experiences, and Rob shares his experience that's a little bit different. We'll talk about that later. But the evidence and the corroboration and the sharing of similar elements of their story makes you realize that something is happening here that appears to be a very, I don't want to say repetitive, but similar circumstances that make you think there's something going on here that is worthy of additional exploration, which is, why we heard one story and then we did research, and then we found that there were a lot of those. We spoke to Bob Smith and Barbara Lamb, and they said, oh yeah, this is very common. And we were kind of surprised that it was something that was talked about a lot, but it wasn't talked about publicly that much. So I think the challenge with that is finding people who are willing to step forward. And we interviewed several people who were not willing to come forward with their story because they just weren't ready. They weren't ready for the impact that it might have on them individually, to their family, to their relationships, to their jobs, career. So there was a few people that stepped aside and decided that they wouldn't, move forward. But we had the brave ones that were, and their lives are going to be put on display for everybody to see in a couple of weeks.
You actually took the question out of my brain. Talk about synchronicity, which was going to be, before you filmed the people you did, how many did you talk to that didn't want to come on camera for a multitude of reasons, especially the ridicule factor, which fortunately has been diminishing, but not quite. If anyone says, yeah, I was taken by aliens and I'm pregnant now, who's going to believe it? Literally, who's going to believe it?
Yeah, that's a different story. It's a whole different story when Jack was in a conversation that we were having earlier. We were talking about the idea that, there's steps to belief. Jack, why don't you just kind of pick up on that? Because you did such a good job when we were having that conversation earlier today about, the whole concept of where you start in the belief paradigm.
Sure. And I think it happens with all of us. It's a process. It starts with, and in my case as a child, but at a certain age or whatever, it's like, okay, well, there's a light in the sky. There's a craft in the sky. So you kind of wrap your head around that. It's an unknown, it's an unidentified and flying object. And okay, all right. So then you go to the next step. Well, it's piloted by an intelligent force, intelligent being or whatnot. And then that might be an ET, an extraterrestrial. So then you wrap your head around that. Well, is there life on other planets? Is it possible? Okay, yeah, sure. I buy that. And I think today most people do, especially in modern day, today's day and age, I think most people now, because science and even NASA, and they've come out and said, of course, there's life on other planets, and there's probably a lot more life out there than we originally thought there was. So then you get to that stage of it, but then it gets a little trickier, because then you start, it becomes a little closer to home, and that is people being abducted against their will. And that becomes a little unnerving. And then you're like, okay, well, is this possible? Would they do this? Would an ET race want to do this? And you look at cattle mutilations, and then you say, okay, yeah, I can see them doing that. We experiment with animals, and we tag animals, and we do the same thing. So maybe they're doing that to us. And then you go further, and it's like, well, what are they doing? What if it is there's a hybridization program, and it has something to do with our DNA and the manipulation of our DNA. So again, you keep going further and further down this rabbit hole, and and slowly but surely you accept something, and then you go a step further and say, well, maybe that's possible. And then you get into the whole idea of interdimensional versus interplanetary. And we can go into that. That's a whole, quantum physics conversation. But yeah, it's a process for most people to get to that point to even consider that, women are having these unexplained pregnancies, and it could be because of abduction scenarios with ETs.
You're absolutely right that it is a process. It's one thing, for instance, when I saw unidentified craft that definitely did not operate with our known laws of physics, to seeing them, to picturing who's piloting the craft, and then picturing how they're engaging with us. And like you said, we humans do this to our fellow animals. We've been doing this for 50, if not 100 years, testing on monkeys, testing on mice and rats, and you name it.
That's right.
Now, how long would you say from the process, from the first realizing that we are being visited with some sort of craft that definitely is not operating with our known laws of physics, to, okay, these guys are not just, or guys and gals are not just visiting us. There's multiple species of them, and when they come, they take the females up here for their projects.
Yeah, think about, back to 1947 when this kind of really landed on the public radar. Is that it was all about craft.
Yes.
And in evidence of potentially beings in parts of craft, to Betty and Barney Hill and the publicity that surrounded their abduction. So, the headlines and the horror and the disbelief that something like that, and the discrediting that went on. So then you fast forward all the way to now, and you hear something on the news, you read something on the web, and you kind of like, yeah, dime a dozen. There seems to be a huge acceptance to how far we've come. But as Jack said earlier, there's so much further to go. We've always talked about, that whole idea that a lot of people who struggle believing, whether it's a fear for them, or they truly don't have a space for this in their mind, or they're looking for evidence to knock them on the head so that they have that moment of clarity that it's like, okay, now I believe. What they're doing is trying to put it into an earthbound paradigm, because that's all we know. So what really we need to start doing is, from a humanity perspective, is to start looking at ourselves as part of a much, much larger picture, a cosmic picture. And when we look from the cosmic perspective, we may be much lower on the evolution scale. And these beings are much further along in their evolution, and they're studying us in some way, shape, or form. And, as Mark D'Antonio says in the film, these beings don't have a sense of morality that we do. So they might think that it's just part of what they do, whereas we see it as something horrific. But the fact that it's happening is something that more and more people need to be made aware of, so that they can start to have conversations and do their own research and create this public discourse, as opposed to this, in the shadows type of conversations that allows it to be even more acceptable for people to come out and tell their stories, to share their experiences. Because when we're as a community, as a humanity, as a cosmos, that we're talking about things that are happening, and we're looking for ways to integrate and better understand our place in all of this, that's when we grow and evolve. So it's we could very easily get into the whole metaphysical side of this, but the evidence that we've seen and the conversations that we've had with the different individuals that we've interviewed over the course of the last 8-9 years with the different film projects that we've worked on lead us to believe that what is happening to these individuals so convincingly that their stories are worth being told and worth discussing and worth exploring further.
You know how you mentioned that they must have a different morality because what they're doing is so horrific? The same could really be said about us if we weren't humans, meaning if we were, say, chimps, right? You'd look at the Homo sapiens and be like, wow, these guys are twisted. Using us for experiments and,
Right.
rats
Right.
to grow human ears. But from an ET's perspective, let's just say if they, okay, I'll put it back to humans, but thinking of an ET's perspective. What if we're just an alien ant farm in the sense that they don't know who the queen bee is? I mean, the queen ant is, or they don't know who to go speak to. They don't know who's the representative. Besides, there's 200 plus countries, so everybody can, in essence, claim that. So when they're entering here, is it plausible to expect them to go to the UN or the White House? No. Chances are they're going to go wherever they can and interact with whoever they can.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. For sure, is that, and again, these are conversations that we've had numerous times. That okay, so what we know is what we believe to be the existence of humanity at this moment in time, and all we have to do is look back historically to see there's been major advancements all the way through time. And for us to sit there and think that we're at the peak of knowledge and the peak of awareness and the peak of evolution is crazy, because it's constantly proven, over and over again that we are not. Where there's so much more to learn. In the film, we used the concept of expanding circles, and Ralph Waldo Emerson did a essay on circles, which basically, in a nutshell, says that every time a circle of knowledge expands, there's more that we don't know. So, when we've talked about this evolution of thought that started back in the 40s to where we are today, that circle has expanded quite a bit in the last 70 years. But how many more questions are now that we have to ask as a result of that expansion? I think that's where we are right now, is that there's so many questions that we should be asking as opposed to avoiding.
As you mentioned that this started 70 years, that could absolutely be argued because in Roswell, that was the first case where the military released a press statement saying they have a flying saucer. This didn't come from a random journalist that was not affiliated with the government to one extent or another. That's why, when I ask this question to so many other people who are researching crash and retrievals, why is Roswell stick out more than anything else, aside from the sheer number of witnesses, is solely because of who released the initial report. But on the other hand, we know that there are lots of paintings that show objects in the sky from 500 or 1,000 years ago. I was even able to uncover a British medical journal which showed two very skinny grays, and they were operating they had no instruments in their hand, but they were dealing with another being in a bed. Now, for any of those skeptics or debunkers who say we got the image of that particular alien, the gray, the short gray with the big eyes and the big head, we got it from the movies. How can that be if that already existed in a medical journal, let alone what else it's been portrayed in?
Wow, yeah, it's a good point. Well, I think Roswell is really isn't that kind of considered the beginning of the modern
Pinnacle.
UFO?
Yeah, it's considered the golden age. Yeah, the
Right.
start of the golden age. But
Right.
again, we have Nuremberg, Germany, right? You have balls, you have like cigars. It seems like in that one particular painting, I wish I had a ability to show it to you, but I'm sure you've seen it. You'd be like, oh, okay, I know which one you're talking about. But it seems like almost like a war within our skies. And then you have a painting of Jesus on the cross and someone in the background with their hand over, with their head looking up into what looks like a disc shaped object. And then this can go back as far as you go back in history. Look at the Egyptian hieroglyphics. If people read literally Greek, I hesitate to use the word mythology, but that's what it's called, but Greek mythology or Egyptian mythology, I don't think they were fantasy as much as they were truth for several reasons. One, if you were someone who can write, which is very few at those times, if you didn't write what was really happening or what the king or emperor wanted you to write, you'd be beheaded. Why would you think the first thing someone writes is a fantasy? No, they're going to write either what's happening to them or what's been passed down from the elders.
And that's something that I've experienced. I've been traveling throughout Central America and South America for the last year, and I've gone to a lot of different archaeological ruins. And one of the things that is, conversations that I've engaged with, shared with people what it is that I do, and that I'm on this constant search for information as it revolves around the sky people. And one of the things that has been shared is that, well, they documented what they saw. They were documenting for the purposes of recorded history. They weren't telling stories. They were documenting a battle. They were documenting leaders. They were documenting a certain ruler's brain. They were documenting. They weren't making up stories in these different drawings that were made. And they're in every single location that I've been to, and I've been to, and I've asked what about the sky people? What is the connection, to this, whether it's Mayan or Aztec or Inca or, a variety of smaller, different indigenous tribes, where they all say, oh yeah, there's an oral history. And there's a documented history of a connection to the sky people. So we talked with George Zervos, who we will feature in our next film, specifically about that whole idea of mythos. And his take is that it really is, it's kind of hard to believe it as a myth when at the time when it was being documented, it was what they experienced. It's what they saw. So maybe what is being shared is the more of the reality, but that's just what they saw. That's what they framed it as. They had no concept of the cosmos in the way that we do now. So we can sit back and say, like, oh, 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, this is what they saw based on the knowledge that we have today. But in those times, they would look up in the sky. They had no idea of what the depth of the universe was. So they only reported what they saw, what they experienced. So given that mindset, given that circle of what they understood in that moment, they shared what they knew. And there are plenty of cave drawings that have the typical face, as you had mentioned, that go back 10,000, 20,000 years. Where did it come from? They were documenting what they saw.
You actually used a better word than I should have used. They documented it, right? And like you said, cave paintings, 10, 20,000 years, they were very crude paintings, cave paintings. They clearly had no alphabet, no language, but they were able to draw the big heads with the big eyes, and various different would look to be like saucer-shaped discs. And we know now, based on what the DoD released in 2017, that they're not just saucer. And of course, from witnesses, you have spheres, you have cigar-shaped, triangles, or there's just so many different. But the idea still goes back to is it didn't come from imagination. I mean, what was everyone tripping on ayahuasca 20,000 years ago and decided, let's share the trip? I doubt that. Now, let me ask you, how many people came forward that was willing to go on for this film? And again, I saw this, and I'm just trying to give a portrayal for everybody out there who is going to see it.
We started by talking to people of influence within MUFON and also within the regression therapy world to say, do you know people who might be willing to talk about their experience? So we got, I think it was a list of about 30 different people,
Wow.
and we screened all of them and selected a handful to be in the film. And one of the things that we wanted to do is make sure that we got some new stories. There's people out there who've been sharing their stories for years, and it's the same story. But we wanted to bring people who were, in my opinion, and I think in everybody associated with the creation of this film, is that they were brave because they are willing to share their story for the benefit of people who have had similar experiences to better understand that they're not alone, but also because they think it's important for the masses to know that these type of things are happening and they're having a traumatic emotional impact, and they're changing the way these individuals see the world, see the cosmos.
I'm going to predict, and this is just a very logical prediction, and it's probably going to come true if it hasn't already, just from your screening. When this hits the masses, I promise you, people will come out that have never spoken before and said, if they had the guts to tell their story, I'm going to tell my story too.
Yeah, and I think that was one of our objectives with this too. Was and it started, I think, our objective primarily in the beginning of this was to share more of the phenomena of unexplained pregnancies. And what it turned into over the course of the process of doing the interviews, both on the phone and then also the live, was this is about humanity. This is about how people look at other people who've been through something that they don't understand. Do we spurn them? Do we embrace them? Do we listen to them? Do we empathize with them? We empathize with people, and this is mentioned by Melinda Leslie in the film. We empathize with people who have been through trauma, if it's related to illness or death or something happening in your life, a loss of a job, a loss of a spouse, a divorce, that we're there. We lend an ear, we lend a shoulder, we listen. But when somebody shares a story specific to a UFO abduction or an experience that doesn't fit with something they understand, we turn away from them, or we're driven by fear to mock them or ridicule them. Which is, we saw that there's a group of people here who are willing to be extremely vulnerable about what happened to them and how it impacted them individually and how it's changed their lives and how it's, emotionally impacted the way they operate in the world. And we're like, why would anybody raise their hand and say, yeah, this happened to me. I want all this attention. I want to be ridiculed. I want to be looked at as an outsider. Why would anybody do that?
Nobody
That's a big
wants
part of it.
to. That's what I've realized. Nobody, because you probably know that I worked with Ciro Yvonne Smith. I used to present at her Ciro events. Nobody there wants to. And the handful of people that do want the attention usually are not legit. You know what I mean? They're like, I know a couple people who make their money off hoaxing and creating images so they can get in the spotlight. But any legit person who has been taken, who's had these horrific experiments on them, who's had hybrid children, they always say, why me? Why me? And they don't want that spotlight on them.
That's true. And the sincerity comes through. And, when we did speak to a lot of people before actually shooting the film, and we were on the phone with several dozen people. We were kind of vetting them. We just wanted to hear their story, and some of them had phenomenal stories, but they had really good reasons why they really just, in the end, decided they didn't want to go on camera, and we totally respect that. It's interesting. One woman who's in the film is shadowed. It's almost like a mob show with the witness protection, kind of thing. But she, then there were a lot of reasons for her to do that. And she comes from a really small town in the Midwest, and everyone talks. So, but we appreciate the fact that she decided to talk to us at all and go on camera, even though it was blacked out. But her story is fascinating and it's extremely emotional. But we had to, when you're listening to people I think that sincerity comes through, and you know right away the people who are they're confused, they're scared, they don't have the answers. And sometimes when you speak to it, there were a couple people. It's like it's almost like they're too good at telling their story. It becomes like a
rehearsed, right?
Rehearsed, and also like it's their thing that they do, and all of a sudden they're looking for the book deals and da da da. And look, we don't try to deny people to make a living, right? I mean, people do what they need to do, but the ones that come across as like, that you can tell look, this happened to me. I'm embarrassed almost to talk about it. But I don't know what to make of it. But I can tell you this, it's really taken a toll on my marriage. It's really taken a toll on my friendships. It's interfered with my professional job. And nothing good has come from it. Nothing. And people they're not lying when they're talking like that. And John and I, oh my God, John, how many people did we talk to? And there were some people who had great stories, and the woman in particular, when they were talking about these false pregnancies and some of the things that had happened to them. In the end, they decided, look, I just can't go on camera with this. But it was really great talking to you guys. And it's right. I mean, it's like even just being able to talk to us, and we're not therapists.
They feel better. Yeah, but they
let it off their chest, right? That's why they're feeling better.
Yeah.
I'm getting the impression that they weren't even able to tell their families, right?
Yeah. That was one of the women that we spoke to. She said, I really want to share my story, but if I do, it'll ruin my relationship.
Right.
I won't be able to move forward. It will be it. But she's like at odds because she knew how important it was to tell her story because it validates her. I think that's a big point too, is that these people who share their story, they feel validation that I'm getting this off my chest, especially when they get other people who come up to them and said, I can relate to you.
Oh, that's a huge thing. As I mentioned, many of them, many are so fearful to tell, like you mentioned, a spouse or any family member or even their closest friends because they're all going to say you're crazy, you're delusional, you're this and that. But once they start to talk to someone like you, gentlemen, who listens, and then they hear about other people that you've both talked to and put on camera, like you said, the validation is sometimes it's all they really, really want because they're finally getting the evidence that says this really happened. And it really happened because it happened to you too.
Right. And they all have had this, my life before the event and the awareness and the knowledge in my life after. And some of them struggle with I really wish I still had the before because I was ignorant. I didn't know. It was easier. Others embrace it and realize that this is an important journey to share what's going on and realize that maybe they were tapped on the shoulder to play a much larger role in creating awareness around this.
Now, I know, and you already even hinted at the next film, which will be, I'm assuming later, 2021 or something like that, the third one?
Yeah, it'll be out a year from September. It'll be in 1 year, a little over a year.
Oh, well, that's pretty darn quick. And so let me just plug in right now because I've never said the date. Every time I plugged in Extraordinary the Seating, I just said in September. We could tell everybody now that on September 3rd at 3 a.m., right?
Correct.
Which is a very crucial time, as I told you guys before the show. And I'm sure a lot of the people listening right now who have had experiences themselves can also talk about that time, 3 a.m., 3:33, or somewhere in between. It just seems that there's a more hotbed of activity. You don't get as many cases of people being plucked on the way to work or if they're in high school or college, whatever, they're not, yeah, you have a handful of cases. I did a show not too long ago with Preston Dennett. He wrote an entire book about schoolyard encounters, right? But that's a small portion. The majority of the people who are taken are one by one, and generally when the sun is down, not just down, but when usually the rest of the world is asleep, meaning in our time zone at least.
Right.
Now, what was the most harrowing experience that you were able to show in the film?
Wow.
Wow. Yeah.
I know, right? That's a very loaded question.
Well, and then one of the challenges was the amount of time that we spent with these people, right, Jack?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we talked to them for hours and hours. So, what about? Oh gosh, the name. What's her name? From the one who had the military experience.
Niara?
Yes. That was pretty harrowing.
Yeah, hers was so Niara Isley, who has written a book and has shared her story in the past, but she was our very first interview, and it was a one of those things that as you talk to her, you can tell, even though these experiences happened to her years ago, decades ago, that it was still very present and still very emotional for her. And we couldn't serve everybody's story in the capacity, because each one of the people that we spoke with, we could have done an entire film just on their experience, because they're profound, and the rabbit holes that you can go down from each one of those stories are profound. So our challenge was to find the commonality, but also share the differences in their stories, and share it in a way that is both engaging and educational. So we wanted to make sure that we were engaging the audience so that they could really, at the end of the day, think deeper, about it. So the stories that are shared in the film are, I would say, all of them are kind of the top of the line of their sharing with us. Some of them we didn't go into as much detail at their behest, because it would give away, especially with the woman that was in the shadow. Her story impacted her because it's a small community. A bigger part of that we share briefly in the film is that there's over 60 people who go to support groups to this day for something that happened 25 years ago. And she said, yeah, this is a regular event for us getting together and talking about what happened, because it happened to the entire community. It didn't happen to just a handful of people. It happened to an entire community. And when she starts sharing some of the details of her story, it makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck, because it doesn't fit into, it's like, how is it possible there was so much activity in this one location? How is it possible that the government engaged in the way that they did, but never really talked to anybody that lived there? But they were present, and they were all over the place, but didn't engage. And some of this.
Talk
Go ahead.
more about the military encounter that, where did I write her name, is that Niara encountered. Was she taken by ETs with a military a human on board and then brought to an underground base?
Well, the way she shared it was that she was in the military. She was woken up, and Niara, if you're listening and I get it wrong, my apologies. But she was basically, it was as if there was a drill going on. And she said it was her and a couple of other people that were all brought to this location where, they were startled out of bed. They were brought to this one location. And she said that, they were under the impression that they were there to do their jobs. And it turned very different very quickly. And there was, she termed it, there was, different sounds that were going on that she said, I would assume that these would be used as more like torture and to confuse and, get you out of your headspace. And eventually long story short, she's in a situation where she used the word that she was physically raped by a being while others watched, including military personnel.
And that begs the question: is are they in cahoots? Or going back to Eisenhower, depending on how much of the story you believe, where he left the golf course at Palm Springs and ditched his press, which we all know whenever the president travels on Air Force One, they have an entire fleet of press that follows them, that goes with them wherever the president goes. He was able to ditch a lot of people and went to Muroc Airfield, which is now called Edwards Air Force Base. And there he was given a demonstration. Well, first of all, he met a few of the entities, given a demonstration on how they operate their technologies, and was told, or essentially a treaty, that he will allow a certain number of people to be taken for experiments as long as the president and the government is well aware of who and is taken and how many people are, and in exchange for technology. But we know that's not true, because so many people have surpassed that number that Eisenhower met. And again, this story has been told for 70 years now, almost 70 years.
Yeah. Well, that agreement was obviously breached a long time ago. And we've had, in the last couple of days, we've had a lot of discussions, and one of the things that keeps coming up, and I find interesting, and it kind of muddies the waters a little bit. When we talk about this treaty, this agreement with it, and a lot of people who are familiar with ufology, they've heard of the Eisenhower story and exactly the way you tell it, and it's a fascinating story, and in a lot of ways it makes sense. But one of the and this is talk about layers, but are we talking about one ET race, or are we really talking about several? And that's where it really gets complicated, because let's say Eisenhower and our government had some kind of an agreement with one ET race, and I've heard, and I'm sure there's a lot of maybe different versions, but I heard that we were approached by I don't know if it was the tall Nordics first to and it was much more kind of a metaphysical love and light ascension kind of agreement that they would help us ascend and evolve in the way that would be healthy for the human race. But instead we decided to make an agreement with the Greys, who, because it was all about technology. Remember, it was the Cold War. So in the Cold War, it was like nothing mattered but us having it before the Russians did. So it was very short-sighted, but it was like, give us the technology, and you can do whatever you want with our cows and our people. But I mentioned the fact that, if there could be several. We interviewed a gentleman. We interviewed Clifford Stone, who's a very well-known, crash retrieval, phenomenal guy. It was absolutely a memorable day with him, and we interviewed him for the third film. But one of the things that he talks about is that there's 47 ET races officially.
50, yeah, he said 57 before 57. He left in the 80s. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and now think about it. If there are 57, and they all have different agendas, so if that's the case, then maybe it makes more sense. So maybe some are doing these really bad things to people against their will, but maybe some of it is kind of love and light, and very almost angelic, and they're trying to help us in our next step of our evolution, and they really care about what happens to us. So it could be a combination of several different things going on at once.
And it has to be. I really wouldn't think that they're all from operating on the same I don't want to say condition, but even if you want to put them in a federation, but their agenda, I would think, would vary from each individual one. Let's just say
Right.
the short grays are trying to create a hybrid. Well, then what are the reptilians? And I'm being very broad because from the accounts, there are multiple different kinds of grays, and I'm sure the same thing with the reptilians. But what are they doing if they're creating hybrids? Are they just trying to compete with their fellow gray? I mean, what is the outcome? And it's not like they're telling us, and it's not like I can call a reptilian up and be like, hey, I need you tomorrow for 2 hours. We're not going to get these answers.
No.
Right.
That's a big challenge, I think, with all of this, because we don't know the truth to any of this. We speculate, we do research, we hear accounts, we corroborate data, we analyze, we explore, we try to poke holes. I mean, we've been doing this for a long, long time, for at least 100 years, with experiences and documentation. So where is the truth? And that, I think, is part of what we're trying to do. Is we're not trying to say, in the films that we're making, that this is the definitive absolute truth. What we're trying to do is to share information that has for so long lived in the shadows and bring it into the public conversation, so that these discussions go from look at that crazy person over there who says they've been abducted, to, guess I feel so bad for that person, they went through an abduction. That's really where we would like to see the conversation move, from being something that is looking at these as social pariahs, to people who have, deserve our empathy, and that we should listen to them, and we should look for ways to have all the people, as you mentioned earlier, that aren't telling their stories because they're afraid to feeling comfortable enough that they can. And one of the things that happened for us, after the first film came out, we had over, I would say, close to 1,000 messages that came into us through emails and direct messages on social media, with people saying variations of, thank you so much for sharing this story, because it makes me feel like I'm not alone. Thank you for letting me realize that there are other people out there just like me. I had something similar happen to me. I now know I'm not crazy. So when you start to see that type of reaction, we realize that there's a lot of people out there who are not talking. And one of the reasons that we kind of went the direction that we did with this film is to encourage people that there is a safety net out there, that there are a lot of people, there is a tribe, there is a community for you to associate with that isn't going to make you feel bad. They're going to actually make you feel better, because you realize that you're not alone, that you're not crazy. I even had one woman who sent a direct mail within the last month or so, who was saying, I need to reach out to somebody because, my partner's had an experience, and doesn't want to talk about it because he's afraid of how it might be perceived. And she went on to say, is there anything that you can do, any direction that you can point us? And I had another person who was a personality in music, and said, I can't go public with this because it'll ruin my career. But is there anybody that I can talk to in confidence? So this is the type of thing, when you hear those types of reactions, where you realize that this is not about telling science fiction stories or trying to show outdo something else that's out there in the public. This is about helping people deal with what they're going through, and also helping people who haven't experienced it better understand what those people are going through.
How did you both, and you could speak for Jamie since he's not here, how did you all three transform throughout this movie? Or from between the first and this new one?
Oh, John. I don't.
But I'd start with Jamie. Jamie,
well,
Jamie
yeah.
has gone when Jamie first got involved, Jack and I were working together with a different production company in developing the story about Stan Romanek. And for a variety of different reasons, that relationship kind of went sideways and they decided to step out. And we still felt passionate. Jack and I still felt passionate about it. And we were like, is there any way that we can salvage this? Because we've already done a lot of research and put a lot of effort into establishing rapport with Stan and his family and the people who were surrounding him, both as witnesses and experts. So we were like, we just don't want to walk away from this. How can we save it? And talked to Jamie, who kind of stepped in and was willing to he looked at it as like, well, yeah, if you guys are doing this and you believe in it, then sure, I'll do it too. And he helped financially and helped us, kind of keep it moving forward. But at that point in time, his response would be, yeah, I don't believe in any of this stuff.
Yeah, of course. But then he sits in front of
people. But then he sits in front of, the different interviews that we had throughout the first film. And then he sits through the different interviews that we've had during the second film and even now for the third film. And he has come from someone who did not believe or thought it was kind of a little far-fetched, a little bit, fringy, to my paradigm has shifted. I have a different appreciation and a different understanding, and I'm looking for answers now. Is he, has he flipped 180 degrees? Probably not, but he has moved so far, and that's kind of, again, shows you what can happen when you sit in front of people, when you hear their stories, when you get the detail. I've said this before. For all the people who want to debunk, how many of them have spent a day, 2 days, a week with someone who's had an experience and having them tell you the depth and breadth of what has happened to them? No, they're just reacting to something that they saw, something that they read, something that they didn't believe, and they just want to discredit it. So spend the time, get to know the individuals, because when you do, you start to realize that there's a fragility there, that none of them want to get to the point where it's breaking. And they're always looking for a safety net of some sort to help them not fall through the cracks. And that when you're sitting in front of somebody, whether they had an experience 30 years ago or they had an experience a year ago or a week ago, that still exists. That fragility is still there. And they have to constantly pump themselves up and prop themselves up because there's not enough people who are there for them. And that became very apparent to me. That was the paradigm shift for me in this film, was that, I joke around about this now because 3 years ago, the thought of doing another film in this genre was not on my radar. I was like, I don't want to be pigeonholed as somebody who's making just genre-based films. There was other ideas that Jack and Jamie and I had all talked about that we wanted to do. But once we started getting the response that we got to the first film and started hearing all the different things that the people were saying, that, as far as thank you for helping me realize that I'm not crazy. Those type of things start to sink in. It's like, well, maybe this is more about the human experience than it is about the phenomena. And that became very apparent to me during the interviews for this second film, specifically when I interviewed Melinda. It was like an aha moment for me because she really brought it home that this is about people. This is not about phenomena. This is about people.
When you're sitting across interviewing someone like that and you have asked the question multiple times, you get a different answer, but it's the same answer, but just different words. So it shows it's not scripted, 1. 2, there's a lot of emotion. And 3, from just body language, you can tell what this person is telling you is not BS. I would think that really changes you. And I've done about 800 interviews, and I'd say at least a third of them were people who have had direct contact, whether on board encounters or literally taken, or even just ran into some non-terrestrial beings that had extraordinary technology. That is, like you mentioned earlier, I think it was Niara, if I'm saying it correctly, her experience of 25 years ago, she said it like it seemed yesterday, because nothing on this planet, in our conventional terms, would be like that. I would think even 25 years from now, when it's 50 years old, it's still going to be like yesterday, the most profound moment to her.
And the people who've had those experiences, when the story doesn't change, they're speaking from truth.
Yes, from the heart.
From the heart. They could tell that story every day. It's like going to, asking a musician, do you get tired of singing your biggest hit? No, because it means something to me. It's important to me. It's etched in who I am. It's my existence, type of thing. So when you talk to somebody who doesn't vary their story every single time, and there was a couple of people that we've talked to over the course of the last, I would say 7-8 years, a couple who are in this film, that as we talked to them about the different stories, they never changed. I mean, we first met Sierra Neblina in, I think it was 2011. And when we heard her tell her story to us for the very first time, it was jaw-dropping. And we said, at that moment, we have to do a film about this. And it was specifically about these unexplained pregnancies. Sierra is a lesbian. She has never been with a man before, and she got pregnant.
Then she would have no reason to be pregnant other than something non-terrestrial. Right. Wow.
But every time we spoke to her over the course of, from 2011 until 2018, when we were working on this, her story never changed. It was the same story.
Right. So I tell people all the time, because people ask us, well, I don't know, how do you feel? Do you think it's true? And, and we all started kind of from a different place when we first started doing this. But what I tell people, I said, sit in front face to face with a veteran, a 70-year-old military veteran who is, tough guy. I mean, been through it, been to Vietnam, been to wherever, and watch him break down in front of you telling his story about an ET encounter, and tell me that's not going to change you forever.
Oh, somebody who's had bullets flying by him, someone who's seen his friends blow up in front of him from grenades or bombs. You would think that person is very seasoned, and for them to break down, something clearly invasive usually happened to them.
Right. And I think what it does is, and this is something that hopefully, we're there when the interviews are taking place. So we're literally face to face with these people, and it's just, okay, unedited, tell your story. And that is something that is an experience that we can't, we share that through the film. We share that through filmmaking, and hopefully it resonates with people. But on a personal level, when this happens over and over again, this even happened with Stan. People, Stan's, there's a lot of controversy with Stan, and he's full of it, and his story's not true. And John and I always tell people, it's like, we spent time with Stan, we spent time with Lisa Romanek, his wife, and we spent time with other people who were close to him.
Victoria, right?
Exactly right. And let's say, look, we don't know for sure 100%. We don't know anything, right? But what we can tell you is that Stan his life was basically destroyed because of these things that were happening to him. And no one on the face of the earth would ever choose to be Stan Romanek. But if people have never met him, and they haven't been face to face with him like we have been, and have seen that emotion and seen what it has done to him and his family, they're just, they don't see it. They're not feeling that emotional tug that we did when we were there with them. So, I think it's a great question you asked, because we did, I remember, John, when we first started, when we first went down, started with the Romanek research, we were interested. It was all about filmmaking, and it still is. It's all, let's make a good films. Let's make quality films. And we had always wanted to do a documentary. And I think at the time I had already been more into the research and gone down the UFO rabbit hole. And John really hadn't. And he didn't want to. He wanted to kind of stand back as a director and say, I'm just going to go into this as, okay, tell me what's going on here, and I'm going to put a great, that we're going to create a narrative that's going to be compelling to the audience.
You mean trying to stay objective?
Yeah, correct. Absolutely. Stay objective, and also be good storytellers. So so that we honor their stories. We honor the stories we're telling. And what happened is, I think certainly by the time we were done with Stan's film, we were different, a little bit different. We were like, wow, this is, and we had some things happen to us while we were making the film that were, kind of blew our minds. It was profound. And we were like, okay, this is interesting. So we decided we're going to make the second one. And really when we made the second one was when we realized that, yes, we're always going to make a quality film first and foremost, and we were going to tell good stories. But what we realized is that there was a sense of purpose behind what we were doing, because it became about these people who were telling us these very personal things and willing to go on camera to tell them. And we felt it was our obligation, our responsibility even, if you will, to share that in a respectful way. And I remember talking to Jon right after we finished the second film, and and Jon, you can take it from there, but you were like, I've totally, thank you for this, because this has changed. I see something here that I didn't see before. And it became much more about the people and being that conduit, and to be able to tell their stories, in which we think are very profound and very important. And so, yeah, we have changed a lot. I think we've changed a great deal, and we'll continue to as we make more of these.
Did you guys, is there any commonalities between each case, or are they all drastically different?
Oh, I think there's a lot of commonality. Jack, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of commonality. And look, I mean, this goes way back. This goes to Bud Hopkins and John Mack, and the the first, the people who first started to really dig into the abduction scenarios. And what they would say is, they said it in their books and they said it in interviews, is that there are a lot of common threads in these stories that these people are telling. And what it suggested to them was that there was a real phenomena occurring, that it wasn't hallucinations. The people would say, well, it's people hallucinating, which is absurd. But the commonality is there. I mean, a typical abduction scenario doesn't change very much. There are little differences in the way people describe things, and sometimes, obviously, in the ETs that they describe are different. But yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of basically the same thing is happening to all of these people.
Yeah, and their awakening to it is varies. How they become aware of their experiences varies dramatically, and sometimes their experiences vary dramatically. But when you start to hear about the process that they go through once they reconnect to the memories, once the veil is lifted, there is that connection to the sequence. The sequence is almost always the same. And, every single one of the women who've been through the abduction hybridization, program, they've all pretty much shared the step-by-step. It starts at a young age where you're, for lack of a better word, tagged and monitored when you're 5 to 7 years old as a woman, until you're fertile when you're in your early teens. And then that's when the abductions start. And that's when they start harvesting eggs, and that's when these women start having the recollections through regressions that this happened to me and has been happening to me for a long time. So whether they're 20 years old and coming into that reality, or 60 years old and coming into that reality, they can almost always point back to that moment, an abduction story when they were a child and were, for lack of a better word, tagged and monitored, which is, when you think about it just from that point of view, it's frightening.
Now, let me ask you, okay, since you've shown me the screening, I've talked about this one particular case, and maybe you could fill in who it was, if it was Rob or Geraldine, or maybe I'm wrong on those, where it was the ETs presented, or one particular, presented themselves as a perfect human, a perfect woman, and what looked to be like a tear in the space-time fabric was sort of like a tear in the cheek area on the face to reveal what was underneath. Now, I've always wondered the two things. One, is that just a legitimate tear in space-time fabric, a tear in their veil? Or two, are they purposely revealing themselves through that hole to make it known that, look, we are presenting ourselves as a perfect woman, but really we're not a human at all?
Well, there was two stories. There was one that was specific to Rob Fullington, and another one specific to Geraldine's. Rob's was very different. He was he was abducted and basically given a tour of a facility that included, I guess you could call them replicants, or what's the word? Not replicants, but these bodies in that were suspended in fluid.
Yes.
And
tubes.
They were
yes.
the tubes.
Yes.
And he saw all this, and as he was being guided on this tour, he said that there was at one point these tall whites that were walking by him, men with long hair. He said, it looked like human beings, but he could tell that they weren't. But as they walked by, he says there was kind of like a glitch in the matrix, a little thing where he could see that the veil was, removed a little bit, and it was I believe it was draconian in nature. The
being underneath, right?
Yeah, the being underneath. So he said that was a trigger to him that, I'm being deceived. And he didn't like the situation that he was in. So he was saying how that it's an illusion that they're projecting about, the positive. So he felt like he was being kind of duped in the situation that he was in. The other one with Geraldine was about, she recalls, before the regression, that she went out to a bar with some friends, and she said there was a really handsome gentleman that she met there, that she says tall, basketball player, tall. She was very attracted to him, wound up talking with him. And she goes, I don't remember a lot of what happened after that. She goes, in my waking memories was that, we said goodbye and I went home. She said, but during the regression, I found out that I didn't go home. I actually went back somewhere with him. Said, don't recall if it was at home or someplace with him, but that it was the intention was for insemination. And she said at one point she could see through the veil, and it was not this beautiful man that she saw. It was a being that was beneath that was basically using her for the purposes of insemination. And it was horrifying to her when she realized that she was being used and manipulated. And she said he went from being like this person that she was enamored with to this almost robotic, dark eyes and just mechanical robotic way of moving and then getting up and walking away. And how many times has that happened? How many times have the screen memories kind of torn just enough that we can see behind them? I'm sure if there's anybody listening that has had those type of experiences, share those experiences. Find somebody that you can talk to, so that you can realize that you're not alone. You're not alone in having those type of experiences, because Rob's was different from Geraldine's, but both very similar, that there was a screen memory or a projection that they wanted you to see that wasn't the reality.
You just made a good point and a better term. screen memory, which also implies that it was specific to her, right?
Mm-hmm.
So other people may have not seen the being at all, let alone the screen memory of a human basketball, built perfect being. And again, this still goes back to the higher question. Is it that the screen memories are failing because of something that has to do with us or something that has to do with technology, or are they legitimately trying to let us know this is how we're presenting ourselves to you, but this is not who we really are? Because if I was to see a perfect woman coming up to me and there was a tear or a rip or a hole on the face that revealed something else, I think I'd be less fearful at the start than would it been a reptilian or a draconian or a gray just walking up from a distance. I'd run the opposite way.
Right. Well, from what I understand, Jack, correct me if I'm wrong, in what has been shared with us, not only from people who've had these experiences, but also from experts who've interviewed a lot of people, and also Yvonne and Barbara in particular, who've done the regressions, that they say that the whole concept of screen memories is to protect us from the harrowing experience, from the traumatic experience. It's their way of saying, like, well, we're going to pluck you from your life that you're accustomed to. We're going to do something to you that would be uncomfortable if you were aware of it, and then we're going to kind of like give you this memory that makes it either seem like it didn't happen or help you better see it as a something that would happen in the course of daily life. So it's basically their way of kind of like hiding it from you until you go into a regression and you see that tear in the fabric and it starts to open up and you start to see the realities. Then that changes. Usually it isn't, a conscious thing where somebody comes back and says, hey, I had a dream last night that I was abducted and I think I might have seen an alien's face behind this imagery. It usually comes out from regressions. Is that pretty accurate, Jack, based on what we've seen?
It makes sense what you're saying. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost kind of a gradual. Yeah, it would be too much for most people. To
like me, right? Like I said, I'd run.
Oh, well, I
think we all would.
Yeah, yes. I mean, we think we'd be. I don't know. We think, oh, that would be so awesome to. Yeah, but if it ever really happened, and it is, and I think that's done that way on purpose. And I don't think, and again, we don't know for sure, but I don't think that their technology would necessarily fail. I just think it's a question of slowly, that those memories would come back slowly and over time, and a lot. But however, if it wasn't for regression therapy, you have to ask yourself how many people would actually remember that they were abducted.
I know there's only a small portion. I could only think of one person that has 100% memory recall, and that's Jim Sparks. Almost everybody else will remember something, but usually it requires hypnosis to get the full detail, because our consciousness, if it's too fearful, doesn't belong in our paradigm, we suppress it. That's just our defense mechanism.
Right, absolutely.
Now let me ask you both about the children. Children of those taken, children that don't look like humans, and you even showed that in your first film where Stan, and then this is the crazy part, it's almost like time doesn't matter. When he was younger, I'm now, again, I'm referencing the first one with Stan Romanek. When he was younger, he recalls his sister answering the door and him going and seeing these grown up, half human, mostly ET beings. Only did he realize later in his life, when they started appearing around, maybe one came to his lecture, that I think he made the realization that was them all along. So instead of aging, they de-aged, unless time doesn't matter.
Yeah, the whole idea of the children was probably the strongest. That really is what sparked everything for us. Because when we initially met some of the people who were involved in Stan Romanek's case, we were sitting down at a restaurant and they started showing. John wasn't there. I was at this conference in Denver, and we were still looking for that story, right? That great story that we wanted to tell for the documentary. And they showed a photograph of a hybrid girl, supposedly a hybrid girl, in Stan's backyard that was captured. And that moment changed my life. You want to talk how we've changed and how things change your life. That resonated with me at a level I don't think anything's ever resonated with me on. And I remember seeing that photograph and calling John afterwards and saying, John, we found our story. This is the story we need to tell. And the reason for that was, yes, because to me, it's almost like it's the why. We could talk about the what all day long. What? Well, people are being abducted. What? They're being, there's some kind of a hybridization kind of program going on with, they're being experimented on, and their eggs are being taken, and men's sperm is being taken, and et cetera, and et cetera. But the why, the end game, if you will, to me was always these kids. The final product of all of it were these hybrid children. And we didn't go into it too much in Stan's documentary. What we kind of did was we had a little bit of it in there and kind of teased it then we knew we were going to talk about it more, obviously, going into the second film. But the hybrid children, it's the reason why they are doing what they're doing, is to produce these hybrid children. Now, to what end? We're going to explore that more in the third film. But that was the major impetus for us, and certainly for me at the beginning, to say, hey, man, this story's worth telling. And there's something about children. So it's also there's an emotional element to this, because both the men and the women, when we'd sit there and Stan would start crying when he'd start talking about these kids, because there's either a paternal or maternal instinct that kicks in, and it's their children. It literally is part of them.
That's true.
And when women talk about it all the time, and abductees, and they're aboard craft, and years later, and all of a sudden they're brought into a room, and there's these children in this room, and they're hybrid looking, they're strange looking kids, and one of them is brought up to them, and the ET will, say, the woman will know that that's my daughter, that's my son, and telepathically, the ET will say, nurture her, love her. They want to see that nurturing going on. And sometimes there's a theory out there that says that they can't really nurture them that well. So that's why they bring the human parent back on board from time to time to nurture them. So that tugs on your heartstrings. That's about, being a parent and loving a child. And regardless of why and who and what these children mean to our future, which is fascinating, there's that very base human emotional element of, oh my God, that's a child. And that I'm really glad you asked that question, because, and John knows this. I mean, I was like, John, it's about these kids. It's about these kids.
Yeah, and Jack wanted so much to make that the main focus of Stan's story, and me coming more from the newbie kind of ignorant and naive person was, well, if we start there, we're going to lose our audience. We're going to be having the conversation with the people who already believe. We will narrow the audience. So we made the conscious decision to say, let's move that to the end of the story, because then people will see the evidence throughout Stan's story, hear the conversations specific to his personal experiences, hear the experts talk about it, and then slowly be introduced to the children in the latter third of the film.
Right.
So that was a good point for us to say, okay, we led them to the water in the first one. Let's have them take a big gulp in the second one.
Yeah, phases, right? We slowly but surely we started A. If we would have gotten too much into that right away, we wouldn't have been starting at A. We would have been starting at, M,
Right.
and a lot of people wouldn't have been able to absorb that.
Yeah, so it was a conscious decision for us to say, like, how do we do this in a way that does move a story into a more the masses, the general masses. And I've said this before, and I know that I've alienated some people who are within the ufology world, is that we didn't want to pander to an audience that already believed. And, a lot of people kind of criticized us for telling a story that's already been told. And it's like, well, to who? Like Stan's story, so many people are like, well, we've already seen this story before. We've seen it in his presentations. It's like, that's fine, but our objective was to bring this to the masses, not to just tell a story to people who wanted more. It was really to bring that story to a much bigger audience. And we kind of knew once we started making the second film that we wanted to go through this ongoing series of extraordinary films that would take us deeper into the conversation, take us deeper into the understanding of the human existence as well as the evidence that exists, so that 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road or maybe 20 years down the road, when people look at our series of films, they'll understand that there was a logical progression there, that there was a desire to make it more digestible, understandable to people who might not have been exposed to it. And, we've told this story before too, is that when we screened the film, the first film at the Fort Lauderdale International Film Festival in November of 2013, I had a friend that came up to me a couple of days later and said, I really needed to process this before I had a meaningful conversation with you. And she said, I really have to let you know that I was stunned by the time I walked out of the theater that night. And she said, the reason why is because I'd never really thought of this in this context before. I was aware of it. I've seen it in movies, but I never really thought of it as something that was happening to people. And I believed Stan. I believed Lisa. I believed the people that corroborated his story, by being witnesses or by the experts who talked about, it was like, I never thought about this before. So, and this is a highly educated person in their 40s. And how many other people out there in the world who are aware that this is happening from a movie perspective is not aware that it's happening from a reality perspective? So we really were, that was a nugget for us to say, we're intentional. We're on purpose with what we're doing here, which is to educate, which is to create awareness, not to just find evidence and dramatize it and glorify it and create conflict. No, what we want to do is, bring these stories to the masses so that you can make a decision for yourself. Do I believe it or not, based on what I've been presented with? We're not trying to convince anybody of anything. We're trying to present stories that seem very compelling based on the corroborative evidence, the experts who support it based on what they've experienced and what they've researched. There's something to it. And if more people spent the time to kind of peel back the layers of the onion, I think they would be very surprised at what they learned in a very short amount of time. And that's intentional on our part, is to help make that happen.
The last one, correct me if I'm wrong, was distributed by the Orchard Entertainment, Jim Martin, right?
Correct.
Is that the same thing with this current one?
Yes, it is. We have a 5-year agreement with the Orchard to create content.
Jim's a good guy, and you know what? I truly, he is. I know I've spoken to him several times. We go back years. I would think part of the plans in the long run are to place this on Netflix.
Here's the challenge with that, is that what I've come to learn over the course it was an anomaly for the first film to reach Netflix in the way that it did. Usually what winds up happening is that a film has to be promoted, distributed on digital platforms, gain an audience, show that there's numbers and support behind it before Netflix would even engage in a conversation. But because Stan's evidence was so compelling, when they saw the executive at the Orchard, which is now 1091, the Orchard sold off the film division earlier this year, so it's 1091 Media. But when the executive saw the film, he said, I think that the Netflix team is going to be very interested in this. There was no pitch deck put together. They just sent them a screener and they bought it on the spot, which shocked us, to be honest with you. So with this film, what's different about it is a couple of things. One, it doesn't have the evidence that got them so excited, but we think it's as compelling or even more compelling than the first film. That's one. Two is that Netflix is in a completely different era than they were when we had that first conversation with them 3 years ago. So they're in more of the original content, the Netflix originals. So they're looking to develop their own thing. They are very rarely now licensing independent projects. So that, what we've learned now is that the distributor relationship with these platforms, the content platforms, as opposed to the digital transactional platforms, is that they need to see some traction. So the goal will be to pitch it to the Netflix, the Amazon Prime, the Hulu, the Gaia TV, to see if there's interest in a licensing agreement, but we're not going to know that for months.
Now, let me ask you about the children. Some researchers, particularly David Jacobs, who wrote about this in his last book, and unfortunately he can't do interviews anymore for health reasons, but he was convinced and said that through his decades of talking to people who have been taken and working with hypnotherapists, that they saw that each generation of hybrid children looked more and more human. So let's say you took a human, you took an ET, and you crossed them. You're going to get half and half. What happens when you take that half and half being with another human? You're going to get only 25% human, right? Have you seen any evidence to show that through each generation, these hybrids look more human like us?
Gosh, first of all, that's funny you mentioned David Jacobs, because we actually did interview him for our third film, and he goes into great detail about that and his kind of what he feels. And people who are familiar with David Jacobs know it's more of a colonization theory, that there's nothing good about this. But we were fortunate enough to be able to sit with him, and John interviewed him. So he will be in the third film. But it's funny. We talk. This is one of the conversations we have probably more than any other, and I find it fascinating, because if you look back to I don't know if you're familiar with a book called Rachel's Eyes.
Oh, yeah, one of my favorite. Linda Moulton Howe turned me on to that book. One of the few books that she turned me on to that I still hold in high regard.
Yes, absolutely. One of my favorite books in this field that I've ever read. And Helen Luttrell, the mother of anyway, long story short, in that book, without getting into too much detail, it's this experiment, basically, with this alien human hybrid girl who they try to
assimilate, right?
Assimilate, yeah, right. She goes to college, and I think it was a community college in Northern California, and she has this roommate, and the roommate was the author's daughter. So that's where that story comes about. But when I read that, when you read these different things, so I always go back to that, and I tell people, think about this was in the early 70s. And in the early 70s, here they are trying to assimilate her, trying to see if she would fit in. And ultimately, that experiment failed. And I don't want to give away too much of the book, but she had to wear wraparound sunglasses. She had to wear a scarf around her head. Her skin was a completely different tone and color. She couldn't show anyone her eyes, because if they saw her eyes, they would have freaked out.
And
So this
and
was
the hat too, right? Long
right. Yeah,
clothing.
all this, and she wore a jumpsuit, so no one could see most of her body. She had to have food delivered by two basically men in black, men in suits, dark suits, that would deliver her food once a month because she couldn't eat normal food. So, you think about how it's an evolution of technology, right? And you think about the beginnings of the first heart surgery took, 11 hours or 12 hours. And it was, the poor person who had the first open heart surgery, right? It was brutal.
And
But
the
now,
first ones didn't succeed. We're
didn't.
talking about the first one that did succeed. How many failed to get to that point?
Exactly right. So think about it in this. Take it to this and say, okay, so if these ETs are experimenting and they're doing these hybridization experiments in the 1970s, this was the hybrids didn't really fit in. It wasn't. They couldn't go undetected, and now you're hearing more and more about people saying, "Oh, they're here." David Jacobs. There's tens of thousands of them walking among us, and we would never know it. Now, we don't know if that's true or not. We don't know what the numbers really are. But if you perfect a procedure, and maybe my head just goes here. Maybe, they're practicing with all the cattle mutilations. They're practicing on the cows, right? They're using the hemoglobin from the cows to do experiments, and all of a sudden it's getting better and better, and they're creating more of what they want. Now, we don't know in the end what they want. What is that hybrid percentage? What traits are they going to have from humans, and what traits are they going to have from the ETs? What is that perfect hybrid? We don't know what they're after. But yeah, I mean, I think there's been an evolution of hybridization. Now, I don't know how far back it goes, but I look at it let's take it from the late 40s, early 50s to today. And I think there have been, advances in that technology on the ET end that have made it they fit in a lot more, and they actually could be your next door neighbor and you would never know it.
Especially, and if you got a chance to talk to Dr. Jacobs actually about this, where he talked about that in the last 20 years, not only were they being taken, they were shown scenes of human life, like a grocery store. What do you do? Oh, here's a house with a door. Well, what do you use keys for? Things like that.
Right.
The impression that all that gives is like, trying to be more like us, maybe to either be, like you said, a next door neighbor, or if they look different enough, and we knew they were different enough, at least to act like us. Because if they act like us but look differently, then we probably wouldn't fear them as much.
And you know what I've heard too, and this is really interesting, that even though now they look a lot more like us, the thing that often gives it away is that they don't act like us. They're still, I'll call it an emotional human intelligence, where it's the simplest thing. Like maybe their clothes look ridiculous. Like They look like us, but they're dressed like they're colorblind. Like, right, what are you wearing? Because they have no clue.
Lack of emotions too is what I've noticed.
Right. There's only so much you can do. The word infiltrate comes to mind, and I know that Dr. Jacobs would absolutely use that word, infiltrate, in order to colonize. But and again, we don't know what the purpose of it all is. But yeah, interesting. I love talking about it because it's really opens up. I had an encounter, and I neglected to tell John this story, and I don't know how I ever neglected to tell you, John. And then I told you like 2 years after, and I thought I had told you, and you're like, you never told me that story. I had an encounter at an airport, at the Atlanta airport. And it was one of the most, again, for me, one of the most profound experiences I've had in what I consider the ET realm. But I was coming back from New Mexico. It was during when John and I and the rest of the crew were actually working on Stan's film. So here we were in the middle of all this. We're getting strange phone calls. It's just a lot of weird stuff going on, and it's amazing. And we're going through this journey of making this film. Well, I had come back and I had to fly through Atlanta to get back to Florida. And at the Atlanta airport, I was actually with my family. And I remember walking with, my wife and my son. And my son at the time was probably 10 years old, maybe about 10. And we're walking through the gates. at the terminal, and I look around to my right, and standing at a gate, is this girl. And you talk about taking a double take. I mean, you try to be polite, but this girl was like nothing I've ever seen before in my life. Her eyes were, when you talk about alien hybrid, she was it. Her eyes were so slanted, big, and close, like they almost came to the tips of them came together in the middle of her head. And I took a double take, and my 10-year-old son even was like, "Dad, did you see that?" Because he's pretty aware. He's aware of his surroundings, and he was all into this. So he's like, "Dad, did you see that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I did see that." And I wound up walking. We had gone to a restaurant because we had a couple hours to kill before our connecting flight. And we sat down, and I remember saying, I told my wife, and I said, "Look," I said, "I need to go back. I need to try to get a picture. That was messed up." And they're like, "Okay, we'll order for you." I'm like, "Yeah, let me just try to go back to the gate and take a picture." So I go alone. I go back. Now I'm walking the opposite way. So instead of her being on my right, now I'm thinking, obviously she would be on my left if she was at the same gate. So I get to the gate, and I look to my left, and she's not there. So I look to my right, and she's standing no more than 10 feet in front of me, staring at me, and as if to look at me saying, "Can I help you?"
Like she read your mind.
Yes, yes. And I got to tell you, I flipped out. I mean, it was that classic like Dudley Moore scene where I'm fumbling and bumbling and falling down a cliff. Like she caught me so off guard that I couldn't get a picture. And then all of a sudden, real quickly, she went to and actually boarded a flight. And I always tell John this, the oddest thing, I'll never forget it. It was a flight to, of all places, Detroit. Now, I don't know if she actually got on the plane, whether she phased interdimensionally out of the airport. I don't know. But she was waiting for me to come back because she knew that I knew. And the only reason I knew is because I had been exposed to. We were working on Stan's story.
You know, when you're describing her eyes, I'm reminded of his book, and I think you showed this in the documentary as well, where it has his hybrid daughter, and she's watching him give a lecture, and it's a side view of her. And like you see the eyes, they're like, whoa, how did that go by with anybody not stopping her?
Right, exactly. Right, yeah, people are so like, they go about their business and they don't see anything really. They're just kind of like zombies. But anyway, yeah, exactly. When you see, and what was really funny about it too is there was one guy that was very busy terminal. Atlanta's a very busy airport, and when I first saw her to my right, and my son saw her, there was a guy sitting about 5 feet from her. He was actually sitting in a chair, and he saw us look at her. He looked at me, and he gave me a look like, yeah. Do you see that? He noticed it, and he looked at me like, yeah.
You're not the only one seeing it.
You're not the only one seeing this, because that is now. Okay, and I say this, I usually preface the story with this, but there could be some kind of an eye defect. Someone could, you know what I mean? Like, I hate to say, it was a hybrid for sure, and then I find out 10 years from now there's actually a defect that people can have to make their eyes look that way. But the fact that she was literally staring at me when I looked, she was looking at me when I came back, before I was looking at her. She knew I was coming back. She knew. She read my mind, and she was ready for me. And I remember John's like, "I cannot believe you didn't tell me that story when it happened." And I'm like, "I thought I told you."
I can't believe you didn't get the photo.
It's too bad we don't have access to TSA. Otherwise, I would think the surveillance would show her.
Right.
Oh, right. It's been quite a few years, but I just. The coincidence is just too much. It's just too much. I mean, it's the fact that here I am, we're working on this film, and then all of a sudden, here's this girl that there's no way that was a normal girl, and I don't think, I tell this to John all the time too. I'm like, "John, we're not finished with that. There's going to be more that happens with these hybrids, with us personally, and so we'll see what happens."
Now, one thing that I've seemed to have paid it since I've been paying attention to this topic, literally since '84, and then reading things from long before that, including that medical journal I was telling you from 1895, plus the cave paintings and everything else, it seems to me that they're unstoppable. If they want to show up here, there's nothing that can prevent them from coming here.
Right.
You would think that, and I don't know if there is some sort of a galactic agreement. If is it, you would think it would be, if they have all this technology, it would be very simple that they could just be here at a moment's notice. But they seem to spend an awful lot of time trying not to be detected.
Yeah,
why?
That's true. That's true.
What would be the reason why? And we're doing some research into a different story, which has given us access to information that is mind-boggling. But there is that sense of things that have been shared with us, is that we can only do so much. We can, and I don't know what that agreement is that prevents them from making themselves present, because they could do it. They could have done it a long time ago. I find it hard to believe that a race that is this advanced has, every once in a while, somebody falls asleep at the wheel and crashes a craft. It doesn't seem.
I know, it
doesn't seem plausible.
100 of them is what I've recently heard from Richard Dolan.
Yeah.
In the U.S., That's a lot, a whole.
Yeah. So, is it intentional? Is it were they shot down? What would be the reason to? Is it drips and drabs? Is it gravity? Who knows? I mean, there's got to be a reason. Maybe that's there's some master plan that says, we'll make ourselves present after all these things that help people condition. But then again, you ask why. Why not just show up? If you believe in the colonization, why the slow burn? Why not just come here and say, take me to your leader? We're taking over. So again, this is the part where we've had these discussions before, and we're doing this exploration, and we're sharing these stories, and we're trying to tell them in a compelling way that engages and educates. But we don't know the answers. We're not. No one's been given the magic or the ending. No one knows the ending. It's not like it's the Avengers. Where everybody knows the ending but the public. Just the inside group knows how it's all going to end up. That's not out there. And if it is, there's a lot of secrets. And if there are shadow governments and global families, the Illuminati, that are aware of the end game, so be it. We're not tuned into that. And we've talked about this jokingly too. Is if we ever to get to that level, chances are pretty good we'll be taking a dirt nap pretty quick.
Right? I would think so. Very quick. There's several questions that I missed, and in interest of time, I'm going to go to a couple, because then I want to spend the rest of the time promoting the film again. So let me see. I'm just going in reverse order, whatever pops up. Frankie Zomboy, how many true Christians say they've been abducted?
Well, interesting that two of the people in this film are very religious, and it's shaken them to the core, and it's challenged their belief system. And I think that I think there are. It is a game changer. You have the Roman Catholic Church that's kind of preparing for this. They're kind of like, instead of pushing away, they're kind of saying like, yeah, they're here. It's all part of the big picture, as opposed to others who are like, there's nothing between God and us, and that's all a fallacy, great deception, and things like that. But the religious side of the equation, we've again, this is another conversation that we've had not only amongst ourselves but with other people, is that what's the difference between believing in organized religion and believing in the aliens existing? There's no proof of either.
And remember,
but some would argue
the
that there's
Vatican
more
Church
proof.
did open the doors for that now,
Sure.
saying they would baptize an ET.
Yeah, why not, right? They want to get out in front of it. They want to be ahead of that. So it's just one of those things that there's faith-based, religion is a faith-based institution or a construct, depending on what your belief system is. But I would tend to say that there's more evidence supporting the existence of ETs than there is in this, all-powerful being in the clouds. It's not a lot. There's scripture and dogma in controlling messaging that helps keep the corral door closed, so to speak. But there's a preponderance of evidence that's growing every day about the existence of aliens, but we don't know. We don't know definitively that there is reason for everybody to embrace this 100%, which is why there are such opposing views when it comes to both sides of the story.
This question, I don't know the context of some of these, but I'm just going to read the question part because I don't see what was before that other than other people's chat. This is from Logman Camwriter. I hope I said that properly, Logman. Is it true that women are mostly abducted and that in the time of their days? I don't know if they mean the time of the days as in the times that they're fertile.
Well, based on what we've seen, it's more from the time they become fertile, whether that's 11, 12, 13 years, 14 years old. As soon as they're fertile, then there's the process of harvesting. And there are women who've talked about being abducted, in their 40s because they were still bearing eggs.
That's true. That's true. As a matter of fact, I know a woman. She's in her 60s, and she's had over 20 abductions and was pregnant without having sex, without having a boyfriend or a husband at the time. And even though she's in her 60s, she said the last one happened when she was about 43, 44.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see what else I could find here. Nicholas Cashmore. Could aliens be making us interplanetary and interdimensional?
Oh, I mean, that could be part of the plan. That could be part of this crossbreeding DNA. One of the things about with Stan's child, then a couple times people around Stan and Stan's house had encounters with these girls. They disappeared pretty quickly. They were very fast, but they disappeared quickly, suggesting that they were able to phase in and out dimensionally. So that might be something that the next step in our evolution might be being able to do that.
I think it's just a matter of time before, if you go back in time, we start with burning, was it wood? And then coal to electric to nuclear. Well, what is the next step? If these craft are operating via using gravity to their benefit, gravity generators or antimatter, anti-gravity generators, once we get to that step, that will unlock so many doors that we previously thought were impossible. The future, some people say, is very bleak on our path, but at the same time is really exciting when you think about some of those possibilities. I mean, if we had gravity right now, you guys wouldn't be in different states. You'd be right here with me, or I'd be right there with you in a heartbeat,
Right.
Okay, let me see what else I can find. Unfortunately, when I go back too far, the questions are erased. So if I don't see anything last, I'm going to check the most recent ones to see if there's a question. Okay. This is for you, Jack. It's from Robert Golden. What does Jack think about the alien from Stan's videotapes?
Oh. That's a great question. I tend to go by Stan's reaction in the tape, and I feel like his reaction is real. He's terrified in his reaction to it, and I honestly, I can't tell you for sure whether or not that's a real alien peeking in the window. I really can't. But from my standpoint, it doesn't look like someone's holding up a cardboard figure. That's for sure. I think it's, and considering what's happened to other people that we know, where the aliens tend to peek in, they're very curious. They're always peeking around doors and they're peeking up in windows.
Doorways and windows. That's right. Very often.
They really do. And it's just a question of looking at that video, and it's such an incredible video that we almost can't absorb. We can't accept it because it's so outlandish, right? It's so crazy that we just can't accept it. But you know what? I think that could very well be the real deal. I really do.
And let me add something to that too, real quick, is that the way that was presented to the public on the Larry King live show, there was no context around it in any way, shape, or form. That it was very easy for anyone to see that and go like, "Oh, come on, really, come on." So when you step back and say, "Let me look at the whole depth and breadth of everything that happened to him leading up to that, and then after that," you have a different appreciation. So Stan, I believe, was shocked and scared in that moment, whether it was a being or not, whether it was something that was propagated on him to make him continue to tell the story. Don't know. But that's one of the things that we have said before when people say Stan's a hoaxer, is that, if Stan was hoaxing this, what would be the benefit for hoaxing it? What would be the benefit to do this for a dozen years? To tell this story, because people are under the impression, because he wants to sell films and he wants to sell books.
He didn't make that much money, though.
Anything.
Yeah.
No. Nobody in this does that for financial gain. What they wind up doing and being brazen enough to go out and tell their story is opening themselves up to tremendous ridicule. Who would raise their hand and do that just to propagate a hoax? And we spent time with him. And I go to this one time we were there for one entire week going through every bit of evidence, both video, audio, and physical evidence. He had 3 different bins of tubs of things that he had acquired over the years, that we went through everything. We watched everything. We listened to everything. And there was one night at around 10 o'clock at night that I was watching videos, and Stan and Jack and I were watching the videos in the living room, and Stan came down and he sat down and he goes, "These are hard for me to watch." And he said, because they just they bring me back to that moment. And then he was quiet and just kind of sat there for a while. And he said, "Do you guys think I'm crazy? Because sometimes I feel like I'm losing my mind. I don't know what's real and what's not." It was a moment of vulnerability that,
he was opening himself up. Yeah.
Yeah. You would only experience that if you were spending that time and being in that moment.
When the question was asked, in my mind, what I was picturing was, it's in your new film. I believe it's a painting or just an image you guys created where it's an ET peeking through a doorway, but the neck is curved like at a 90-degree angle. That really struck me. That was an image. That was an image from the woman that is kind of in shadows, and she said, I think she mentions it in the film where she says the angle of the neck, and that drawing was based on what she told the illustrator, and the illustrator created it based on that. And she said that was one of the things about that was so strange to her, is how the neck was bent at such an angle. That's the part that really, again, like I said, it really stuck out with me. The moment I even saw that question, the first thing, I wasn't picturing Romanek's videos. For some reason, you're right, the angle of the neck. I can't get that out of my mind. I can't get the image out of my mind. And let alone had I seen that for real. If I saw a being peeking through a doorway and its neck the angle of the neck was close to 90 degrees or whatever it was, I'd be scared shitless, guys. I really would.
I know, definitely.
Okay, here's the final question I'm going to ask, because I can't go back further. This is broad, so if you can answer it, you can. If you can't, we can't. Okay, do you think that aliens stay away from people who use drugs? And I can tell you the preface about that. Apparently, the Dan Burrish, who worked on J-Rod, said that the mechanism that the ETs use to shut us down, to control us, is by flooding our brain with opiates. Therefore, if you drink, if you smoke, if you drink coffee, if you do any drugs, you're hindering that. So I think that's where the question stems from.
That's a new one to me. I really have no frame of reference for that. But an interesting, definitely an interesting thought process. So keep drinking coffee, folks.
Right, to prevent yourselves.
But hold on, there is something we can refer to real quick. When part of Stan's story, he had a lot of physical ailments, which is often another thing that happens to people who are abducted. And the psychological trauma is bad enough, but there's sometimes they really have some physical, lasting physical effects from whatever they're being exposed to. Stan was one of those people. And he had a bunch, and he still to this day, I believe, is having a bunch of physical problems. But he had this medication that doctors were giving him. So, you get the medication. And we had, I think we put these in the film as well. He would go into his cabinet, and all these pills in these bottles, they would be burned.
Melted. Oh, I will never forget that. And I'm pretty sure, because it was medicine after an injury, I'm pretty sure it was Vicodin or something like that they said, no, just remove.
Right. Yeah, it might have been because of his knee. That knee thing. Yeah. But yes, that was it. But I mean, they literally, the burned, I mean, it was like, are you serious? That's just crazy. But yeah.
Here is the last one I want to ask. Nicholas Cashmore, do aliens physically breed with humans? Physically. Like, for instance, the Greys, they don't have any genitalia or things like that.
All right. We've heard the reptilians do.
Yeah, and we heard that on more than one occasion. April has had experiences where she, through regression, said it was rape, it was penetration. And Geraldine shared the same thing, and Niara as well. So, physical. And there is another person, and I'm forgetting her name, that has talked about specifically having conscious sex with aliens.
Well, there was a farmer in Brazil, I believe 1957, who said that he had sex with aliens. Everyone discarded him until researchers started picking up on him. I think it was Jaime Maussan who first told me about the case. Now,
was it Boas or something that? And the woman he said he had sex with, the alien, looked like a young Michelle Pfeiffer. I mean, it was a tall Nordic, stunning. Well, it could have been a screen memory, but I remember that. That's an interesting case. But yeah, this poor farmer right out of nowhere.
Yeah,
that's the
subject to ridicule for the rest of his life.
Literally for the rest of his life. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, now since I've gotten through as many as I can, let's talk more before we go, since we already went a few minutes over, about the film. First of all, September 3rd at 3 a.m. Tell me why you guys chose 3 a.m. Tell the people, actually.
That was all through the distributor. It sounds good.
It is good.
But it is good. But the distributor, that's all set up through them. So we had no say in that specific timing. And we did talk about the day. One of the things, anybody who's been following this project from when it first debuted last November at the Fort Lauderdale International Film Festival, was that we originally thought it was going to be released in the early in mid-February, and then it got pushed back, and then it got to June, and then it got pushed back to September. So there was a lot of frustration from people who were excited about the fact that it had been presented at festivals, but was not being released. So that's where, when you're working with a distribution company, that they are influencing that part, there's the business part of it. So they definitely played a role in influencing when it was going to be released. And most of it made sense once we kind of wrapped our heads around it, that there's not a lot going on in the alternative news media at this point in time versus earlier in the year when there was a lot of stuff going on. So our objective is to keep talking about it so that more and more people realize that we're just trying to open eyes to the possibilities that something different out there exists.
Now, what's your guys' goal as to what you want people to take away after they see this film?
A couple things.
Yeah, a couple things. Yeah. Well, I would say one, which is kind of our mantra, is to just ask yourself, what if this is all true?
Very big one. Very big.
And to have a better understanding that someone who's going through something that you don't understand doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true.
Right.
We really want people to, we're encouraging the whole idea of treating humans, a neighbor, family member, friend, foe, with empathy.
Right.
When somebody's going through something that has impacted them tremendously, why would they share something with you that sounds so profound, that has impacted them in a way that they seem different? Why would they make that up? So let's be empathetic. Let's listen. And for folks who've had experiences, if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're feeling, well, I really want to see this to see if this resonates with me based on things that I've had in my life. That's a big part of it too. We want people to see this, and if they've had an experience, to share it. Find your tribe. Find somebody who you can talk to. There will be a reference to a resource page in the closing credits of the film that will provide you with access to not only the people that we had in the film, but also other resource groups that can help you better understand what's happening to you, and give you an opportunity to reach out to people that will be willing to listen to you, that would keep your story in confidence, if that's what you so desire. So yeah, our objective really is to ask the question, what if it's all true? To encourage empathy, to encourage people to listen, and to encourage people who've had experiences to tell their stories.
Extraordinary, the seating will be out September 3rd, 2019, 3 a.m. Where can people see it so far?
It will be available on all digital platforms. Be on iTunes, Apple TV, Google Play, Amazon Video, not Prime, but Amazon Video, Vudu, Xbox platform, PlayStation platform, and Vimeo. Those are the ones that I definitely know. There's probably more, but it will be a global release.
Now, when people see this, if people decide they want to talk to you because they've seen others, where can they contact you guys?
Well, the best thing to do is to go to our website. There's a contact page there, j3films.com. They can also go to the film website, extraordinarytheseating.com, and reach out to us that way, or reach out to us through our different Facebook pages and leave us a direct message. So there's a Facebook page for J3 Films, there's a Facebook page for Extraordinary the Seating, and there's a Facebook page for Alt POV TV, which is our kind of distribution channel, so to speak, which we will. And another thing I wanted to mention too is we talked about how in depth we go into these interviews. And if there's some people are probably like, well, I'd like to see the whole interview. Well, I'm glad you asked, because we are going to be launching a Patreon page within the next 2 or 3 weeks that is going to have as part of it the ability for people to see entire interviews. So one of the reasons why we're doing that through Patreon is that we want to continue to tell these stories, and there's a lot of them, but in order to do this justice and do the amount of work that goes into something like you're going to see requires resources, and those resources cost money, and we want to work with very talented people who want to help us get these messages out. So we're establishing a Patreon page to help further the discussion and create opportunities to drive more content to the masses.
Well said. And you know what? Things do cost money. What you guys produce is not cheap. This production is not cheap. Unfortunately, we live in a world that requires money. Even if you're doing good with it, Nothing's really free, and that's the sad part. Let me give a few shout outs, then I want to get a closing statement from all of you. First of all, the super chatters for tonight. I definitely want to thank someone down under, two-headed Tasmanian, Justin T, and all the Blue Crew, as well as Paper Crane Wishes. Also, Nicholas Cashmore, thank you for the introduction to Mr. Powers. I do want to thank Lori Wagner. She's such a sweetheart. I've known her for so many years. She's been really good at keeping me posted about this film and about keeping us connected and everything. And of course, I want to thank my two guests, Mr. Jack Roth and Mr. Jon Sumple. Gentlemen, if you have any final thing to say, what would it be?
You first, Jack.
Keep an open mind and always keep searching for the truth.
Yeah, my thing would be is that just because you believe something to be true doesn't necessarily mean that it is. Challenge yourself to do more, research more, ask more questions.
Well said. And if I could ask you, gentlemen, to please hold on till we're off air real quick. Remember, folks, just like they said, Remember, I always say this, disclosure is in your hands. You're not going to get the president or a prime minister of a respective country to say these things are going on. It's only going to come forth with those who are being, you could say, victims or participants, even willing participants. If they come forward, it requires everybody to have an open mind. It definitely requires respect of others, and again, keep your eyes in the sky. It's all about working together. I think that's really what we all need to end up doing, because the more we're divided, the more we're trying to do something on our own, the less likely we are able to succeed if we do it together. With that, let me leave you with my mantra. This was by Teddy Roosevelt. Far better it is to dare mighty things and to win glorious triumphs, although checkered by failure, than it is to take rank with those poor souls who neither suffer much nor enjoy much, because they live in the great twilight that knows neither victory nor deceit. With that being said, this is Dr. J along with Jack and John, and we are signing off.